So in this video I'm going to be telling you how I got interested in amateur radio and how I got my license and how the hobby has developed for me over the past nearly 50 years. My earliest memory of radio is one of these radios. My parents got married in 1962 and there was a sale on at the Co-op. And as a wedding present, they were given one of these, which is a Defiant radio. And I used to have this in the kitchen and play around with the tuning control. And I was always fascinated by some of the names on the front, like Athlone and Hilversum, Paris, Luxembourg. Could I pick these places up? And realistically, I couldn't, not at that age. But it got me interested in the fact that I could hear voices coming from other places, and that was the beginning of that. Later on, my parents got a national Panasonic, as we called them here, radio to replace that one, and it had shortwave on it, and I could hear all sorts of things on that. I could also hear the Police on VHF, because the VHF band in Britain that the Police used, the repeater outputs were on 101 megahertz AM. In fact, that's where that radio is sitting at the moment. And you could hear police traffic on there. So that got me interested again in thinking, well, maybe you could have a radio and speak to people. We had no CB radio in those days because radio regulation in Britain was very, very strict. We couldn't buy cheap radio-controlled cars. I think you needed a license for a radio-controlled aeroplane. You couldn't buy walkie-talkies. This just was impossible. The only way to get radio equipment in Britain was commercial license, which in those days was what we now call site-specific, or you could have a ham radio license. That was the only way you could get radio on the radio transmit in Britain at that time. So, 1977, and my dad was relatively young. He worked in the hospital. He had a heart attack at work. He was revived on the ward by a crash team. Ended up in hospital. There was no hospital radio service in those days where we lived, so my mum bought him one of these, which was a medium wave and long wave radio out of Boots the chemist, and he had a little earphone. He was in hospital for about a month, I think, because in those days with heart things they did keep you in for quite a long time. But anyway, when he came out, I was given the radio. Tuning across the bands one night, I heard Americans on medium wave, and it was an American football game commentary, and I thought, this is amazing, I'm picking up America. Of course I wasn't. I was picking up German relay for American Forces Network, which I realised that a long time later on. But then I started to tune around the bands and I could hear RTE, which is the Irish broadcaster, and all sorts of stuff there that I'd never heard before. I started to get really quite interested in this because now I could hear people from further away. So my dad's father was quite interested in radio. He had all sorts of radios. He had a valve radio that had VHF on it that he kept tuned to the Police at all times in Glasgow. And he also had one of these. This is a VEF Spidola, which is a Russian radio. His one was an import model, so on the front it said Conveyor 1. Broadcast band radio. The great thing about this is, one, it was a very sensitive receiver, and secondly, it had great band spread. You can see on the dial here, no need for fine tuning really, because the scale was so wide on the broadcast bands. So he gave me this. It was a really hot receiver. The built-in aerial was about 2 meters long. It had, I think I've got a picture here, and that's what the front of it looked like, a bit better picture. So you can see it's actually marked in meters and not megahertz. Bit confusing, but that's the way it was. And it had a turret tuner. I think I have a picture of that. Aerial input on the back. It had a turret tuner, so all the tuning coils for the tune circuits for each band were in this mechanism here, and you turned it round to change band. The only problem with it was it took 6 D-cell batteries, which were very expensive. I couldn't quite afford them. I ended up with very leaky Indian batteries in there that I got from the market. But that's what I had to do because I was really only about 11 years old at this time. So then in 1978, we had a visit from my dad's cousin from Canada, Steve. Steve wasn't a radio ham, but he was quite involved in electronics hobbying. He built televisions and all sorts of things. He was an engineer with John Deere in Canada. He had been a navigator in the RAF in World War II and had quite an exciting wartime experience. Steve brought with him two things. He brought a pair of CB walkie-talkies. So now I was able to transmit either to my sister or to a friend because we had these walkie-talkies. This was totally unheard of, and we're talking before the CB boom in Britain. Nobody had walkie-talkies. But the next summer, I actually heard someone on these. I called them back, and it was boys that I knew from about 3 or 4 streets away, and they'd also managed to get a similar set. So this really got me interested even further, thinking I've got to do something about this, getting some proper radio equipment. That was the thing. But the other thing he brought with him was a science fair kit from Radio Shack for building a crystal radio. And I was just amazed that I could plug in a crystal earpiece and hear BBC Radio Scotland, although it was only coming from a few miles away. You know, this was quite a big thing, you know, the whole magic of radio. Around about 12 years old, I was at high school, and I'd already been to the local library and found quite a lot of amateur radio books in there. But my high school had a radio club at one stage, and they had a lot of amateur radio books in the library, and I got some of them out and started having a serious look at what I could do to get a license. But the cost of equipment was enormous. The cheapest 2-meter handheld or 2-meter radio in those days was an FDK Palm 4, I think. It was a crystal control radio with one channel installed. It was £99. And then the ICOM 2E came out. This is the American version with the DTMF keypad, but it was £159. To get that in perspective, that's nearly £600 in today's money. Given that my pocket money was 50p, you can see what the problem was there. There was simply no way I was going to be able to afford to buy a radio like that. But I had this idea that if I could get a license, maybe at some stage I could get a radio. The only license classes were about 20 miles away, and I realistically couldn't get to them. One day, I was reading the local newspaper, and in the clubs column where they listed all the local clubs, it said there was someone starting an amateur radio club in the town. This would have been 1980, so I would have been about 13 by this stage. There was a number to phone. I phoned up, and the person who answered the phone was Doug, GM2BWF. Now, Doug had got his licence before the Second World War. He'd been off the air from the late 60s to the late 70s, thereabouts. He had quite a gap because of his work, and he'd come back on the radio, and he was acting as secretary of the club. And he said, well, we've got our first meeting this week, you can come along. The club was meeting in the Checkmate Bar in Baker Street in Stirling, and I couldn't go because it was licensed premises because of my age. He said, well, we're actually running license classes if you want to come along. And these classes were being run by Jim Balfour, who went on to be GM4PYJ. He had hired space in the local school, and he had persuaded Ollie Derrick, GM3OM, to be the tutor. So I decided I'm going to go along to this. So, and that's Ollie's QSL card. Ollie was quite an interesting character. He used to live in Stirling, but by this stage he was living in Larbert. His father was the Lord Provost of Stirling at one time. He hired out public address systems for agricultural shows and things like this. So I bought the book. This is a later version of it, George Benbow's book on the radio amateur's examination. The exam was multiple choice, 2 papers, which were administered by the City and Guilds of London. There was one on licence conditions and one on radio theory. By the next year, I think I did 3 or 4 months in the classes, and I thought, I'm going to sit the exam in May because there was an exam coming up. I didn't expect to pass and that I would have to resit it probably in September, but I thought it was worth a shot. and I managed to get a pass. So I was 14 years old when I passed the exam. You had to be 14 to get a license in those days anyway. So I applied for my license, and the call sign I was issued was GM6NRE. The problem was there was such a backlog in issuing licenses because a lot of people had abandoned CB to come into amateur radio that I was 15 by the time my license actually arrived. I was also well on the way to learning CW by that point, so I didn't have that call sign for very long. This is the school that we used to do the classes in, Wallace High School. In fact, it was that room up there. There you go. Where it all happened. I hadn't mentioned my first QSO, which was on 2 meters. My license arrived in the October of 1982, but I'd waited months and months. I'd waited since May and to get the license, and I'd actually ended up on holiday. It was the October school break, and we had gone away on holiday as a family. And when I came back, there was a card from the post office saying that a registered letter had been delivered. They couldn't put it through the door, so I had to go to the post office the next day in the town centre and queue up to receive this letter. And when I opened it, of course, it was my licence, and I had taken my FT207 with me, and I put a call out, and the person who came back to me was Jim, who in those days was GM6IUM, is now GM4VGR. And that was my first QSO from inside the post office in Stirling. And I wanted to learn Morse so that I could pass the Morse test and get a Class A licence. There was a local Morse class on 2 meters run by two guys. It was on 144525. I couldn't afford a receiver that had a synthesizer, so I bought one of these. It's a Marakuru Soundair. Very, very good receiver. It was £50. I had to pay and to have a crystal made for 144525, and I had crystals for S22 and S20, 145, and 550, which 550 was local channel where I lived, where everyone tended to hang out. So I learned Morse. I passed the Morse test. I think it would have been the winter of 1982. So I got my A license in March of 83. Just jumping in from the future to explain how I passed the Morse test. I mentioned that I had done the online classes. I passed the Morse test at the Marine Radio Surveyor's Office in Leith in Edinburgh. I think it was a £15 fee, which you paid in postage stamps. You had to buy the postage stamps at the post office and stick them to the form, and the post office franked that. You took that form with you to the test. My dad drove me through. It's about 35 miles, and I passed the Morse test. So that was necessary to get an HF license in those days. It didn't take me long to become proficient in Morse to get up to the 12 words a minute that was needed. So the Stirling Radio Club developed quite substantially over the years. It went from meeting in the pub. I went to the second meeting, by the way. I think what happened was that my dad went with me, but when he arrived, one of our neighbours was there, and I think he sort of vouched for me. One of the things that I should say is there was a bit of radio activity in my family, and this links to the club in a kind of weird way. My dad's uncle had been a radio experimenter in sort of 1909-1910 period. He had a transmitting licence from the government, which I suppose is very early amateur radio. Low amateur and professional radio was very similar in those days. He also ran a radio shop, and that really is where my granddad got his interest in shortwave listening from, because they had some great radios. He was a burn dep dealer, and they had a lot of good equipment in the family. My dad's best friend Ian was married. His daughter was married to a radio amateur who I think is sadly no longer with us. He was a G4, worked in the diplomatic service as a radio operator. But his father was Doug Harrower. Doug was GM6NX, In fact, his call sign had been reissued, and this is the QSL card from the original holder of the license, which I found on eBay. Doug was one of the people that was always around the family, so the idea that you would have a ham radio license was not a ridiculous thing in our family. So, it was something that my dad didn't discourage, that which made it a bit easier. But as the club developed, we moved into the YMCA building right in the centre of Stirling, and we put up aerials on the roof, quite substantial flat roof. We had a shack there. Our first radio was a Yaesu FTDX 560, which was a very old radio at the time, about 300 watts output on SSB. Wonderful thing. I operated special event station there once during the day in the summer. We had a flagpole on the front of the building that we were able to take down and attach wire aerials to get them really quite high up off the roof. And we also had aerials that went over other roofs that we weren't supposed to go onto. The club's call sign was GM4 TMS, Tango Mike Sierra. But when Doug died, the club got his call sign, and the club is now GM6 NX, and it has been for quite a long time. The club then moved out to Royal Naval Munitions Depot at Bandeath, which originally in a porta cabin and now in the building that it's in. So this is what happens when you've got no money and you're a teenager and you want to get into ham radio. Equipment was basically out of my league. There's a few different things in this photograph, which is pretty blurry, but you might get the idea. For HF, I had a General Electric BRT 400D receiver. Now, this was a very sophisticated radio, and I bought this from the aerial radio group at the BBC transmitting station at Falkirk at Westerglen. The club had a visit up there, and the station had gone automated, so there was only one member of staff there who was a neighbour of mine, Arnold, GM4HDO, who lived 2 houses behind ours. And I think he sold this to me for £6, which was an incredible buy at the time. Okay, 12 weeks pocket money, but 12 weeks pocket money, I could afford that. It had edge-lit band scales, so when you changed band, there was a bulb in the edge here that lit it up from the edge, so it was very sophisticated. Incredibly selective receiver. It had crystal selectivity, variable crystal phasing, and all sorts of things, and a BFO. One of the first things I ever heard on this was American Truckers on AMCB. It was a fantastic receiver, for what I paid for it. It weighed about 40 kilograms though. You could barely lift it yourself. You needed 2 people. But that was the BRT 400. Above that, I've got a Heathkit DX40. The DX40 was a single valve output, 6146, about 50 watts output, CW and AM. It had crystal control. The crystal went in the back. It was FT, I think it's 243 or something, very large crystals. But I had quite a selection of crystals for it. Eventually I got a VFO. And I had a wide aerial, and I only really made a couple of contacts on CW with this system, but it did allow me to get on the air. The other things that are in this picture, a Sinclair Spectrum computer. In 1982, I was doing data transmission. If you plugged that into a 2-meter FM transceiver instead of the tape deck and used the load and save commands, you could actually transfer programs across the air. And I did that over 30 miles on 2 meters, and we were exchanging programs and all sorts of things, which was quite interesting in hindsight that we were doing that. This station is a little bit later on because I have quite a good 2-meter transceiver here. It's a standard, I think it's a C8800 or something. It's FM only, 10 watts output. So my first 2-meter transceiver was a Yaesu FT207. When I got my B license and I was waiting for it, I waited so long for the license to come, I sold my bicycle. I had a huge clear out of all sorts of things, even sold some books and records and things, and I managed to get enough money together to buy a second-hand FT207. It came with the power supply base and an extension speaker. I had a 5/8 mobile whip in the loft, and I was able to get out with that. It worked quite well. I had experimented with using a Pi Cambridge, but it was just the crystal control thing was just too complicated, really, and it was very difficult to make it actually work on 2 meters. In the end, I kind of abandoned that. So as time progressed, I was able to get an SSB transceiver. I heard that GM4TOQ was selling his. He had bought his from Les Hamilton GM3ITN, a legendary DXer in Scotland, 5-band DXCC and everything else. So I bought the SB100. This is a slightly later picture because I've put a desk microphone in here that I got quite cheap for it. And my Morse key there is Admiralty type Morse key. You can see my logbook. And by this stage I had upgraded to an FT290 for 2 meters. I also had a collinear antenna outside. Homemade ATU. Slightly different setup for the computer, but still using it. So I was regularly on SSB. By this stage in the mornings I was getting up, having my breakfast, getting on the radio before I went to school. So I'm about 15, 16 by this stage. So I think I was in 3rd year at high school. And I'm getting up early in the morning and doing this, speaking to people on the radio on SSB, particularly on 20 meters. I've got a 20 meter dipole, and working a lot of countries. The SB100 was a very good radio, covered the original bands. It didn't cover the Wark bands, but we didn't really have them at that stage. And it did SSB and CW. It had a power supply built into the speaker, and that's the inside of part of the tuning mechanism in it. So the FT290 opened up a lot of opportunities because it was a multi-mode radio, and it was also transportable, so I was able to take it places. Ultimately I ended up with the mounting tray for my car when I started driving, and it was a great radio. It covered a lot of bases. It was expensive, so I had managed to save up some money. I was getting more pocket money by this stage, and saving up birthday money and selling my old equipment to buy new equipment and trading up the way, like a lot of people do. This was £249 when I bought it, and that is getting on for 800 in today's money. A standard C8800, I had one of these prior to the FT290. I managed to pick one of these up cheap. It was a very sensitive receiver. Standard ended up being bought out by Yaesu, but they were a very different style of radio from the Yaesus of that period. I'm going to jump forward quite a bit here. This, I think, is about 1988. So I'm about 21 in this picture. We had moved house, still just living with my parents. I was working. So now I had proper equipment, and what you're seeing here is an ICOM 735. It was the first radio I had with digital readout. Prior to this I had a TS 520. The 520 had a built-in 12 volt inverter, and I had it in the Mini, British Leyland Mini car. For antennas I had G-whips, but I also had a full-size quarter wave tank whip for 20 meters, and I could reduce the size of that for 15 and 10. Unfortunately, I've lost the photographs of that, but it was a good system. The 735 did incredibly well. I had a rotatable dipole for 15 meters on the roof. Conditions were quite good at this stage. I had a 40 meter dipole. Eventually I had a 3-element Yagi for 10 meters, and I was one of the first stations on 12 meters when it became available from Scotland. There were really only 2 regular stations on 12 meters, and I was doing huge amounts of CW, sending out thousands of QSL cards. I could sit and work pile up, get 30 to 60 American stations, because I had basically a collinear antenna, an extended double ZEP, which was broadside to the US, resonant. Most people were using antennas here that were for other bands through a tuner. It was quite a thing, and I think that's why this picture was taken. I think it was while I was working a pile-up. Now there was no computer logging, so what I would do is in that logbook I would do 30 contacts. I would then stop, write the 30 cards, turn the page. And that's how I was doing it. And I think in 1 year I sent 5,000 QSL cards mostly for 12 metre CW contacts, and most of them to America. In fact, some of my cards have turned up on eBay, which I think we'll see in a minute. That's not my radio, but it's what the 735 looked like. I had the 250Hz CW filter in it. Then in the car, I had an FT747, which, this was a different car by this stage, a company car. I worked for a blind charity, and we had quite a few amateurs on the staff. And I think the boss had given up stopping us having antennas on the car, so I had G-Whips on the car and the FT747. And I worked a lot of Worked All Britain contacts with that. I also had one of these, which is a Kenwood TH21, which was tiny. It was about the size of smaller than a packet of cigarettes, really. Thumb wheel switches, and it had a very strange lockable phono socket as for the antenna, but it was quite a nice thing. And that's one of my old QSL cards. I was playing the Euphonium at the time, and that's what my QSL card looked like. I don't have one, but I found this for sale on eBay. So there you go. Of course, I then ended up getting a lot of awards. I did Worked All Oblasts in the USSR. I think I had them all. In some cases, I had to make a lot of contacts with people over there to make that possible. I've lost the certificate, unfortunately. But this is my DXCC certificate. This is a replacement one that I got recently, and I don't have the endorsement stickers for it for some reason, but anyway. Yeah, now we move forward a bit again. I went to university in 1990, and I thought I'm going to have to give up ham radio because I'm going to be moving into a flat. That lasted 6 months. After 6 months, I got in touch with Arrow Electronics, or the guy who had run it, and he sold me a Ten-Tec Argosy, which was not a digital readout, but it was a good radio, and I ran that in the flat with a little dipole out the back of the ground floor flat for quite a long time. And then I moved to Livingston and had the same antenna that would be called now a DX Commander. It was pretty much the same thing, but it was mounted on the side of the house with tuned radials, and because I lived on a hill, it did incredibly well. So this is one of my QSL cards. I don't have this photograph, but it shows you what the station was like. I had a memory keyer, homemade ATU, 2-meter radio of some sort. Oh yeah, that's a KDK. Now, I bought that KDK from Martin Lynch when he first started out because I hadn't had a car when I was a student, and then eventually I was able to buy an Austin Metro, and I wanted to put a radio in it, and he was running small ads in the back of Radcom, and I phoned him up and said, have you got a 2-meter radio? And I bought a KDK, so I must have still had that in 1997, so I got my money's worth out of it. In more recent years, I've used an FT450D, which was a good radio, and when I sold it, I got my money back for it. So that was a good buy. This was the station here in my current QTH when I first moved in. It's progressed a lot since then. And that's my station as it is now with the FT710. There is a video in my channel giving a tour of this. And that's my son, Ross, 2M0GJG, operating in a contest on the FT450D. So Ross is also licensed. So it's been a long way since I first started dialing around on this Defiant radio in the kitchen, which really would have been 1972, 73, 74, to where I am now. And the thing that keeps me going really is just that fascination with being able to hear things from far away and get my signal even to the other end of Edinburgh. I find that quite fascinating, that's possible. But amateur radio has become a lot more accessible because it's got cheaper. You can buy a 2-meter handheld now for £30. In fact, I have here, to get this in perspective, this Yaesu dual band handheld was £79, which back when I first got my license was the equivalent of about £20. But as you remember from what I said, it was £160 for the cheapest handheld in those days. So proportionately equipment's got a lot cheaper. HF transceiver back then was equivalent of £3,500. Now you can pick one up for 500, under 500 if you want to. A good quality one, maybe £900,000, a third of the price. So it's got a lot easier from that perspective. Also, I think there's less chance of creating interference because we've moved to digital television and online television. We do have more interference to our equipment from electrical appliances, but I think overall we're in a better position. So I hope someone's found that interesting. Bit of a long ramble, and I enjoy ham radio, and I'm sure I'll continue to. So 73's from Scotland, from GM4 SVM.